Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Open Dialogue. As you know, we are continuing the series with a new segment discussing the current social issues. Today I'm going to be talking about Britain's forgotten destitutes. Yes, we are in a modern society, a Western world, with even the help from the government, but yet we still have a lot of problems within our streets today, which we're going to dive into with our guest. We have already, as you know, Molana Syed. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us. And we also have Marcus Papadopoulos. Hi, how are you?
I'm very well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to go straight into this because obviously we do have this issue where destitutes, I mean, that word in itself, you wouldn't think that you would hear that in this day and age with our, developed world, in our society, and with even the help. So let's just find out, where do you think the problem lies for us to still have these problems, and even to such an extent that even I've read recently the study showing it's over 1.5 million people it was recorded in 2018, even though it's slightly gone down, but still, with regards to that figure, it's quite high for England alone.
Indeed. Britain, let's remember, Britain has the 5th largest economy in the world. Mm-hmm. Britain has immense wealth. But at the same time, there is a great amount of social injustice in Britain. Now, politicians in the UK and mainstream journalists in the UK laud Britain across the world as a country that other countries in the world should seek to emulate. The problem is that many people around the world, many other countries in this world, are not aware that, yes, whilst on the one hand there is an abundance of wealth in the UK, but on the other hand there is another side to the UK. So let me just cite you some statistics. Yeah. In Britain today, there are 14 million people living in poverty. There are 4 million children living below the breadline. There are 300,000 homeless people in Britain, and there are over 1 million people in Britain who are dependent, who are reliant on food banks. Now, once you take those statistics into consideration, mm-hmm. it starts to paint a very different picture of Britain, and it is my contention that the root cause of this social injustice in Britain is this political economic system that has been governing Britain for many centuries now. Because whilst I believe that there are some very positive aspects to capitalism, this capitalism in Britain today is what I would call corporate capitalism. It encourages neoliberal economics, mm-hmm. and neoliberal economics only serve a very small percentage of the population in Britain, and they are the wealthy, whereas the rest of the population suffers immensely. Now, that is something that not many people, even in Britain, are aware of, but Britain has one of the highest rates of social injustice in the developed world. And indeed, when it comes to child poverty, Britain has one of the highest rates of child poverty in Europe. It's even higher than some of the poorer countries in Europe, for example, in Eastern Europe or in the Balkans.
But when you say social injustice, what specific factors are you sort of referring to? You mentioned obviously the political, but does that also spread alongside as to who are these people that are actually regarded as the destitutes that are in poverty? What sort of background do they come from? Is it the minorities that are living here? Where does that come from?
Well, I think that when we talk about who are the people who are the victims mm-hmm. of social injustice in the UK, we have to look at the people who constitute being the most vulnerable people in British society. So they are going to be people from poorer backgrounds. They're going to be people who have to live day by day. They are going to be people who have very low salaries. There are some people in this country who work 77 hours a week, and their salaries can be between 12 to 13 to 14 to 15,000 pounds a year. Now that is absolutely shocking, and there are more and more people who are falling into this category of being destitute because this system in this country is becoming more and more and more fixated on money, more and more fixated on materialism. If you just put your television set on a Saturday night, what do you see? You see programs which, in my opinion, not only are they highly poisonous, highly dangerous, but they're utterly immoral and utterly decadent. I'm talking about programs like X Factor, like Britain's Got Talent, or Love Island, or The Only Way is Essex, because that is distracting the ordinary person, including the ordinary person who is a victim of social injustice. That is distracting them away from what is happening in their lives in reality. And that is something that the British state is more than happy to see on television sets on a Saturday night, because it distracts the population away from their suffering. It is simply unacceptable to live in a country which has the 5th largest economy in the world, but to have millions of people who are living in poverty. 4 million children living below the breadline. British politicians and these wretched mainstream journalists talk about human rights abuses in Russia, in Syria, in Cuba, in Iran. Well, excuse me, I classify a human right as also including ensuring that people are not homeless, ensuring that people don't have to worry about the cost of living, about being able to provide food for themselves and their families. Well, in Iran, they don't have that sort of problem with homelessness. They don't have those levels of social injustice. There are no food banks in Iran. Now, the fact that there are none of those evils in Iran demonstrate to me that the Iranian system is looking after the ordinary Iranian person.
And what about you saying that the responsibility of social injustice is obviously the economy and the way in which we are, serving, or the government serving the rich more. So now, how do we bridge this gap? Because we see that in many countries, to be fair, and it's obviously increasing. Do you think that it's an increase now more so with what's going on, and what are the actual things that's making it to that extent where the gap is widening? Or do you think that it is also a little bit of also personal responsibility?
Well, I think, first of all, the foundation for what we have today in Britain, namely corporate capitalism or neoliberal economics, was built in the 1980s under Thatcher, because Thatcher changed everything in the 1980s during her premiership. Remember, Conservative governments, the Conservative Party, up until Thatcher became leader in the mid-1970s, yes, fully supported capitalism, but it was a far more humane form of capitalism. They didn't believe in mass privatisation, but under Thatcher there was mass privatisation. Thatcher, through her policies, she destroyed the concept of community in Britain. She told people in no uncertain terms, think about yourselves, individualism, make as much money as you can, and by any means necessary. Well, lo and behold, 40 years on, or roughly 40 years on from Thatcherism, that is why we have this situation in Britain today, because people, without realising it, have been indoctrinated. Now, when it comes to on an individual level, well, I believe that is where religion can play a very important part. So if we take Britain, Christianity is the historic and predominant religion of Britain. That is something that we should be immensely proud of. And the church has a big role to play in informing the average person in Britain that their values should be one of spiritualism as opposed to materialism. And the church does play a very important role. I would like to see the church setting a better example. I do worry sometimes about the wealth that is accumulated by different churches in Britain, but of course that is another matter. We also have other faiths in the UK, for example, Islam, and I believe that mosques also have a very important role to play, and I know that they do have a role to play. But I'm also concerned that the same problem plaguing churches in Britain accumulating wealth is also plaguing some mosques in Britain. Now, you know, accumulating wealth has nothing to do with Islam, true Islam, and has nothing to do with true Christianity. Just look what Jesus said about money, about wealth. So I would like to see more of an adherence by churches in Britain to the true teachings of Jesus.
So Syed, now that Marcus has actually highlighted with regards to faith, what do you think that we could do more within our communities to make the situation where we can be even at the forefront, regardless of, you know, the Christianity being the dominant in this country?
Well, I recently came back from Cuba. I had the opportunity to be there for 20 days. I personally witnessed there that no one sleeps hungry in Cuba.
Okay.
No one. And they have excellent system for their own people. If there are shortages, the shortages are due to the foreign policies imposed upon them, sanctions. You could have a piece of bread for 1 penny.
Yeah.
That's why nobody sleeps hungry.
Right.
And nobody sleeps without a house. Nobody sleeps on the streets because the government takes care of them. Of course, I mean, there are shortages, but these are because of the sanctions outside.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is we need to bring, as a Muslim, we need to bring the social justice that was introduced by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, alayhi salatu wasalam. And in Imam Ali's period of time, this is exactly what the situation was. He used to personally go house to house and take care of the poor and needy in the community and the society.
Yeah.
And nobody would sleep hungry like that. And the other thing I noticed in Cuba, in Mexico, I was afraid to get out of my house. In Cuba, I could walk by the beach 3 o'clock in the morning without any fear. Nobody would harm you. I did not see anybody arguing. I did not see anybody fighting there. I did not see any accidents. So
do you see the level of society that are there is quite balanced and equal, though? Do you not see that maybe that is because there is no big difference between, and there's no real gap between the rich and the poor?
Yeah, there is a gap between rich and poor,
Okay.
but and the same thing is happening in Iran. I mean, there is a gap between rich and poor. We cannot say that the Iranian system is infallible and there are no problems. There are corrupt people. We are witnessing, and people have the right to come out on the streets and protest against the corrupt bankers or businessmen who are taking the money out of the country and making the downtrodden people suffer more. So the justice has to be brought in Islamic countries, and they have to bring the justice that was introduced by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam. He wrote letter to his governors and told them to be equal to the most needy people in the society. But we don't see that in Muslim countries. Unfortunately, Muslims have to change a lot.
Of course.
To establish social justice in the society. And according to teachings of Islam, a kingdom cannot survive, can survive with infidelity, but cannot survive with injustice. Okay. If you do injustice to people and members of your society, they will throw you out.
Do you think, Marcus, that maybe in the Western world, you know, with immigration and the sort of selection and variety of people in the country as well that's coming in, it's probably for reasons that are not to the actual benefit in a way, because they're not actually they're probably like used for like low labor and things like that, and obviously not pushing the prices. So maybe places like in Iran, they don't have as much of those issues as we would in the West in that sort of sense, because people do want to come here from different areas, and they do see it like in the States or wherever else that, you know, this prosperity and to live, but obviously that's the dream. So do you think that plays some sort of part in it, to have that, maybe that cultural mix as much?
I absolutely agree. That is a factor. I think there are a lot of people in the world who are misled by what British politicians and British mainstream journalists have to say about the UK.
Yeah.
Yes, we know there are some very positive aspects about the UK.
If you've got money.
If you have money. But let's just take Iran as an example. So I'm very well aware that BBC World Service projects the image to the ordinary Iranian man and woman in Iran that Britain is almost heaven on earth. And if you leave Iran and come to Britain, then you will find a great job, which will have a great salary. You'll be able to buy a great house, and also on top of that, you'll be able to buy a great car. Well, the reality is that, and I'm not condemning those Iranians who fall for it, we're all infallible,
of course.
But many Iranians do fall for this British state propaganda.
Yeah.
So they leave Iran, they come to Britain, and as you said, what happens to them, not just Iranians, but I'm talking about Iranians now, they end up having extremely low paid salaries. They are being economically exploited. They are being bullied at the workplace. They are living in hostels, sometimes even worse. And what do? They contact the Iranian embassy in London and ask for help to return to Iran. And I think they return to Iran because, yes, there are problems in Iran. There are problems in every country in the world. But what Iran provides for the ordinary Iranian person, as indeed what Cuba provides for the ordinary Iranian person, is security and stability, the fundamentals of life. Sure, people in Iran and Cuba, they don't have the kind of luxuries that we have in the West. But you know, they all have houses, they all have homes, they all have jobs, they all have salaries, they all have pensions. They don't worry about turning the heating on in the winter months. They don't worry about not being able to afford food. So, you know, in the West, there's the concept that luxuries are being able to have 4 holidays a year, including skiing. Well, in my opinion, a luxury is having a home, is having a job for life, is having a pension, and is having free education and free healthcare. You find that in Iran, you find that in Cuba, you don't find that in Britain. Why? Because the system in Britain is diametrically opposite to the system in Cuba and the system in Iran.
As you say, like, obviously it's the system, but I also do feel that people's perception of life and living as well in the West is slightly kind of Hollywood. And the expectation is very much like, you know, you go on this reality TV with no talent, no content, no substance, and, you know, you can make it. And obviously 1 in a million do actually, and that's the problem. And these people are being, you know, advertised more and promoted more to give everyone else that sort of jump to say, we can make it easy and we can do things. And so people are like chasing. If you just look at, you know, the social media on Instagram and Facebook, and, you know, the people that get all these likes and followers and whatever it may be, it's the stuff that comes out of it is just, I can't even really comprehend that. It's nonsense, really. So I just think also we have to, as individuals, because I want to highlight in the show that yes, we can blame government, we can blame economics, and we can blame, you know, society, but we are society. And we are also responsible to a certain extent. And I think it's really important that we take that initiative, especially people of faith, because it's, you know, part of our upbringing and way of living to look after our neighbors. And it doesn't say what color, what background, where they come from when it comes to neighbors, whether it's in the Bible, the Torah, or the Quran. And we need to obviously step up in that way and help, you know, within our society and communities and build that. Obviously, there are organizations that are doing this, but even with those organizations, a lot of that money, how much of it is actually going to the actual help now? What do you know about that? And, you know, how can we improve that? Because not everything is 100% voluntarily, you know, run. It needs money still.
Once again, I concur with your analysis. The problem is that in Britain, as indeed in the rest of the West, society is individualistic. It is not collectivist, like it is, for example, in Russia. One of the reasons why communism appealed to Russians, the Russian people at the beginning of the 20th century, was because they already had it ingrained in them. It's in their DNA to think about everyone in community, collectivist, not individualistic society. That's the complete opposite in Britain. That's the way it has been in Britain for centuries now. So how do you change that? You are faced with a Herculean struggle. Yes, we can talk about religion playing a role in that, but I can't see how religion on its own is going to change things. I really can't see that.
No, I agree with you. And actually, while you say that, even when it comes to our religion, like especially, I'm going to come back to you, Syed, we say, okay, we're not individual, we're helping our communities, but then our communities are very segregated as well. We don't go onto the outside of our communities and make it as, you know, humans, you know, humanitarian, you know, sort of like assistance. It's like, you know, we're going to help our brothers in, you know, where we come from. And that's as far as it goes, our sect, our background. So, you know, this sort of like segregation also within the communities does stop us going further and helping. And yes, we have to understand we don't have just one identity. We are British, Muslim, you know, wherever we come from as well. So we can take on several identities and roles and, you know, integrate and make a difference where we are from to the whole. So what do you think? Like, do we still have these problems in our communities? And, you know, if religion doesn't play a part, then our faith is actually failing. I mean, we are failing our faith, to be honest. We may have so much Muslims out there, but the Islam and the real justice of it and the way in which we are actually supposed to portray and represent is actually, you know, in its lowest terms.
Yeah, I mean, we as Muslims believe that religion plays a role in every aspect of our life, including politics. But it doesn't mean that Quran or Islamic teachings have given detailed rules and regulations about everything. For example, regarding economics, it just gives the general rule that be careful, be just, and don't use usury and other things.
Yeah.
And in politics also, it has a very basic and general rules. As long as it doesn't contradict with ethical values and intellect, that's fine, it's acceptable. So Islam is quite open from this point of view, but it does not say it doesn't have a say. It has a say in everything.
I guess also we've been questioned about what everyone talks about, our morals and ethics and values are now being seen differently as well. And there is a difference in sort of translation of that. Not everyone sees the morals in the same way and ethics in the same way, as you mentioned, with the individualism in sort of being a community as well. That's part of that. So now we've highlighted, obviously, a lot of the issues and the problems and what's happening. What do you think are the steps forward to, you know, as you said, nothing is impossible and, you know, we can actually make a difference. So what are the steps from, you know, government to society? What could we do?
Well, first of all, the British public need to become far more enlightened. They need to learn to question far more, and they need to learn to not accept what they are told by their politicians and their journalists. Unless that changes, then there is no hope of reducing, eradicating social injustice that is plaguing Britain on such a gigantic scale. It has to be education, it has to be enlightenment. People need to be told in Britain that it is perfectly acceptable to earn a salary, it is perfectly acceptable to have a house, and if you want to buy, you know, a sports car, that's absolutely fine, but they must have the right priorities. They must be guided by morals. They must be guided by ethics. You can have a nice sports car, but what's far more important is humanity. Whatever that person's faith is, whatever that person's ethnic origin is, humanity has to come first. Because if someone puts their sports car before humanity, then one day when that person loses that sports car because they've lost their job and they're in serious trouble, then the way it is at the moment in Britain, then no one is going to come to the aid of that person. So you can have those luxuries, but you have to have core values. You have to know that humanity is the most important thing in society. It is the guiding principle of any community, or should be the guiding principle of any community across the UK. Unless that changes, then it is simply inconceivable that social injustice will be reduced, even more inconceivable that it is going to be eradicated.
And say if you were running for office or whatever and you have your policies laid out, what would be the main things that you would like to sort of see change? Like, for example, you know, I don't know, increase minimum wage, or sort of like housing prices, for example, not being such a high in certain areas where it's just almost impossible to buy unless you're now, you know, a millionaire. You know, in like sort of, you know, figures that are like 1 or 2 million is nothing nowadays in London, to be fair. So what would be the main sort of factors in economics or the policies that you would see to take this country forward into sort of sorting out these issues where we don't have those social injustice?
Well, the first two policies, the most important policies, would, in my opinion, be health and education. We need to ensure that the National Health Service has all the money it needs to serve the British public 24/7. We need to ensure that if money is being lost, then that is put to a stop straight away. In terms of education, we need to ensure that education is no longer a commodity. We need to reverse the commercialisation of schools, of education. For example, most schools in England and Wales are today academies. Effectively, businesses are running primary schools. Universities are today a business. You know, it has to be said, and I'm not condescending university students, I'm not condescending university degrees, but the standards at universities have dropped. Why? Because it is in the financial interests of universities to have as many students as they can possibly have at their sites in order to get as much money as they can. So there needs to be a thorough reversal of what has happened to the education system in Britain, and we need to ensure that the National Health System has all the money it can. You know, the money is there. Trident, Britain's so-called independent nuclear deterrent, well, it's not so independent because to use it, we need permission from Washington. But that's going to cost £150 billion. So that shows the money is there. It's a matter of priorities. The National Health Service can be made the best health system in the world, providing that is what politicians in Whitehall and Westminster prioritise as #1 priority. If they don't, then there's going to continue to be problems with the National Health Service, and especially in the winter months.
Please do call in. This is a live show, and you can actually participate with your comments or questions, especially that we have Dr. Marcus here to sort of answer anything that you would like to find out even further. So, Syed, what do you think that we could do? Like, do you think it's possible that we could have more volunteers? Because, in our society, in our communities, we do have very highly qualified individuals, professionals, and a lot of them do give their time. But, to set up, like, organizations, which is a mini version of, like, the NHS, for example, or for education, for things like that, so that we can, open it not just for our communities, but for everyone, so that we can sort of show that this is what we believe in, this is how we need to be, and maybe that could be expanded, because sometimes even just transgressing and faulting what's wrong is not going to help in speech, but actually showing it in action with our own small communities and showing that this is a setup, this is what we can do, these are people volunteering, and maybe we can get, you know, the assistance from government later on to expand because it's for everybody. Do you think that's actually a possibility?
Yes, it is a possibility. I mean, especially Islam has advice in all these issues. For example, I was when Marcus was explaining, I was thinking about how Islam describes capitalism or socialism. It's not against capitalism. It's not against socialism. As long as you take care of the poor and needy in the society, you are allowed to be rich. For example, if you are a millionaire and you buy a palace, you have to employ people to look after your palace. And the duty and responsibility for you is to take care of the person who's working for you before even his sweat dries.
Yes.
And take care of him.
Yes.
And also we have a system of taxation, like for example, which is called khums.
Yes.
You need to fix a day in your life, and at the end, every year, at the end of your financial year, you have to check how much you have saved. For example, if you have saved £100, your duty is either to spend the £100, then you don't need to pay tax.
Right.
The idea is to generate the economy, because if you go and buy the mobile for £100, you will be keeping someone in the factory which makes this mobile phone, and if you want to keep that money in your pocket, the only way that money will be legal for you is you pay £20 in charity.
It just came up to my next
So if you don't pay money from your savings for charity, that money is illegal for you. So Islam does teach us. So this is what we need to do in our mosques and centers and madrasas. We teach our youngsters and children from early stages that, look, you can be rich and you can do social justice as long as you are considerate of others in the society. And this is what we lack. Unfortunately, the talks and speeches are either about history or about emotional
lawful and unlawful
things, and they don't teach them practical way of life.
It actually made me think as well as to what you were saying earlier about, you know, religion not actually being the answer. To a certain extent, I understand where you're coming from, but actually if you were to go deeper, like how the Syed explained, there are so many things that sets us apart when you do have faith, because obviously it takes away that individualism, and as well as especially the point of charity, that being such a huge rule in our faith in particular. And if everyone was to contribute in that way, and charity is not just about money, it's giving your time, you know, in so many ways, you know, especially like I said, professionals as well, you know, giving their time for their services. So, and when you mentioned as well education, yes, we always emphasize education, but I think we're not educating what kind of education needs to be. And I think that's where the failure is, because there's education there. We've got encyclopedias now in our fingertips.
Google.
There's lots of knowledge, but we need to sort of direct that kind of knowledge to individuals to build that morality within them, to build these values again, which we don't hear about. That kind of language is not even spoken to millennials and whatever, you know, generation X, Y, and Z is now called. You know, it's just not in that education system. It's very much institutionalized to just a direction which even parents nowadays don't even have a say or contribution. So I think it's a much wider and deeper problem that I see, other than just government or whatever it may be. And it does come from me. I always say that things don't change because we do have the power as an individual. And when we have these kind of thoughts within ourselves, and you spread that and you filter that, that's when you can change society. That's when it will actually build into something a lot more powerful. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, once again, I agree. I do believe that religion has a hugely important role to play in this. But some people might say now, Marcus, you're being pessimistic. I would counter by saying, I'm being realistic now. That is why, you know, I'm so happy to be here today on this channel, because the more channels like this, then there would be more reason to be optimistic. There'd be more reason for Marcus to be optimistic that you could start to change ordinary people's thinking up and down the UK. But we know that mainstream media, broadcast and print, is dominant in the UK. It is everywhere people go. They're on the train and it's on their phones. They're at home, it's on their television sets. They're jogging, it's on their in their earpieces when they're listening to the radio. And mainstream media is emphatic supporter of materialism. It encourages in a very stealth way individualism as opposed to collectivism. Now, if your marvelous channel one day was in a position where it was challenging the likes of Sky News, for example, or Channel 4 News, or another outlet in this country that is part of the mainstream media empire, then there is real reason to believe that something is going to change. But remember, he who controls the media controls people's minds. If you control the media, you're able to mold public opinion in accordance with the political economic system that you serve. And until the day comes when mainstream media in this country loses its dominance, then I'm going to be the Marcus who remains pessimistic.
Okay, well, contrary to that, I'm very much an optimistic. So, again, I will say that the fact that you're sitting here in this channel, and it is a live show on a Sky network as well. So, you know, to be honest, it may not be mainstream, but we have got a presence. And to be fair, you're absolutely right. I do agree. But at the same time, I do have more hope in people. And I do feel that even with all the bombardment of what it is, we know that the reality as well, with all that bombardment, does not really work. Because when people get so materialistic into their lives, as we know, and I've mentioned this many times before, like people in Hollywood, for example, that have it all, it does not really serve them. And especially mentally, especially in that. So I deal with people on that level, and we do know that. So people are, even when they are being so bombarded, maybe for the last generation, it probably was working, but now they're sort of falling backwards and thinking, hang on a second, and they are waking up, and they actually are seeing things for what it is in their actual dimension than outside, or, you know, in their screens. And people are finding that they are questioning, and they're looking beyond, not just here in you know, in the UK, even in as wider as, you know, the United States. People are thinking and getting to that stage where they're not going to be just, you know, sidetracked by what they just see and view. And in a way, as much as we might condemn social media, that in a sense is actually highlighting the reality as well against even the mainstream media, because, you know, people that would not normally have a platform do have a platform to seek and speak and raise issues that would not normally be seen. So it's given us a wider sense of media as well. So in that sense, I think it's quite powerful, and people are looking into those other channels, whichever way it is, to actually, you know, become aware of the real situation. So, yeah, I'm the optimistic there.
Well, I hope you're right, and I hope I'm wrong.
No, we'll see in time, hopefully. But any final words before we end? It was really a nice conversation, obviously, but before we end the show, Syed.
Yes, we should not sit idle, and we should do something.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is part of something.
Definitely, definitely. It's a step forward. Thank you. And yourself?
And I would say always look after your fellow neighbour, because if you find yourself one day in jeopardy, you would hope that your fellow neighbour will come to your help, your aid. So set an example. Humanity must be at the core of our values.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you, Syed, and Dr. Marcus.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much for watching. I hope this was quite bringing a lot of awareness and information again, and hopefully we can take steps forward. It has highlighted a lot of issues, and I know that we sometimes feel powerless in what we think we can do to serve and change, but it really does take about us looking at ourselves in the mirror and making those small steps. And with that said, you know, we can actually make a difference to our society in general. But thank you once again for watching, and thank you to my guests for joining me. Inshallah, we will be here next week with another guest and another topic. And thank you for watching Ahlebait TV and Open Dialogue. We'll see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.